Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. Imagine getting locked out of your own house. Not because you lost your keys, but because your neighbor, a wannabe HOA dictator, had the locks illegally changed while you were out of town. She thought she had all the power, but she had no idea what I was about to do next. I need to get this off my chest because it still makes my blood boil when I think about it. This happened about 3 years ago, and I'm still dealing with some of the fallout, but at least I got justice in the end. I bought my house in 2019. It's a modest 3-bedroom ranch on about half an acre in a suburb outside Charlotte. The neighborhood was older, mostly built in the late 70s and early 80s. My house was one of the originals from 1978. I loved it because it had character, mature trees, and most importantly, it was affordable for a single guy in his early 30s working in IT. When I bought the place, there was no HOA. That was actually one of the selling points for me. I'd heard enough horror stories from friends and online to know I wanted nothing to do with those organizations. The seller confirmed it in writing, my title company confirmed it, and my real estate attorney confirmed it, no HOA. I was free to paint my house purple if I wanted, though I never would. Life was good for about a year and a half. I made friends with my neighbors, fixed up the house bit by bit, planted a vegetable garden in the back, and generally enjoyed home ownership. Then the new developments started going up. About a quarter-mile down the road, a developer bought a huge tract of land and started building what they called Sunset Meadows. It was going to be about 200 homes, all cookie-cutter McMansions ranging from the high 300s to low 500s. Way above what most of us in the older neighborhood had paid. The developer created an HOA for this new section, which made sense. Those buyers were paying for amenities like a community pool, playground, and fancy entrance with a fountain. Here's where it gets complicated. The developer apparently approached some of the older neighborhood residents about joining the HOA. They offered access to the amenities and promised increased property values and neighborhood beautification. Some people bit. Maybe 20 or 30 households out of the roughly 60 in our older section agreed to join voluntarily and pay the dues. I was not one of them. I didn't want to pay $150 a month for access to a pool I'd never use, and I certainly didn't want anyone telling me what color I could paint my shutters. When the HOA sent me the initial invitation to join, I politely declined in writing. I thought that was the end of it. Then Karen bought the house next to mine. Karen moved in during summer of 2021. She was probably in her mid-50s, divorced, working some kind of corporate job she never really explained. She'd sold a house in a fancy HOA neighborhood closer to downtown and bought in our area because it was cheaper but had potential. I helped her move some boxes on her first day, trying to be a good neighbor. She seemed nice enough, if a bit particular about where everything went. Within 2 weeks, Karen had volunteered for the HOA board. Within 2 months, she was vice president. Within 6 months, she was president after the previous president moved out of state. This should have been my first warning sign. Karen started making changes immediately. She pushed through stricter rules for the HOA members about lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, and holiday decorations. I heard complaints from my neighbors who joined the HOA, but I figured it wasn't my problem. I wasn't part of their organization. Then I came home one day in March 2022 to find a violation notice tucked in my door. It was on official HOA letterhead with the Sunset Meadows logo. The notice informed me that my grass was over the regulation height of 3 inches and I needed to mow within 48 hours or face a fine of $50. I was confused. I checked the letter twice. It was definitely addressed to me and my property address. I went next door to talk to Karen since she'd signed the letter as HOA president. "Hey Karen, I think there's been a mistake," I said, showing her the letter. "I'm not part of the HOA. I declined to join when they first invited me." She gave me this condescending smile that I'd come to know very well over the following months. Actually, the HOA board has determined that all properties in the designated neighborhood area fall under our jurisdiction. You benefit from our efforts to maintain property values, so you're required to follow our guidelines. I kept my cool. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I specifically bought this house because it wasn't in an HOA. I have documentation from my closing that confirms that." "Things change," she said with a shrug. "You should have come to the meetings. This was all discussed and voted on." "I wasn't invited to any meetings because I'm not a member," I pointed out. "And you can't just vote someone into an organization without their consent. That's not how property law works." Her smile faded. "If you don't maintain your property to community standards, there will be consequences. I suggest you mow your lawn." She went back inside and shut the door. I was annoyed, but figured I'd just ignore it. My grass wasn't even that long, maybe 3.5 inches. I mowed when it needed mowing, which was usually once a week during the growing season. I wasn't about to let some wannabe dictator tell me when to cut my own grass on my own property. 3 days later, I got another notice. This one said I'd failed to comply with the previous notice and was being fined $50. It included payment instructions and a warning that continued non-compliance would result in additional fines and further action. That's when I decided to handle this properly. I called a real estate attorney who'd helped a friend with a property dispute. I explained the situation and sent him all my closing documents. He confirmed what I already knew. My property had never been part of any HOA, and no HOA could force me to join or levy fines against me without my consent and proper legal process. He drafted a cease and desist letter explaining all of this in legal terms. It basically said, leave my client alone, he's not in your HOA, you have no authority over his property, and if you continue this harassment, we'll take legal action. He sent it certified mail to Karen and the HOA board. For about 2 weeks, I had peace. Then Karen showed up at my door one evening with a printed copy of a satellite image of my property. She'd circled my vegetable garden in red marker. Your shed is not an approved structure, she announced, and this garden area is visible from the street, which violates our landscaping guidelines. I didn't even invite her onto my porch. Karen, did you receive the letter from my attorney? I received it. The HOA attorney reviewed it. We maintain that your property falls within our jurisdiction. No, it doesn't. I have the deed, the plat map, and the original HOA documentation that clearly shows the boundaries. My property is outside those boundaries. We've expanded the boundaries, she said, as if this was a reasonable thing that could just happen. You can't expand boundaries to include private property without the owner's consent. That's not legal. We'll see about that, she said and left. The next day, I received a notice from the HOA stating that due to my continued non-compliance and outstanding fines that now totaled $150, they were initiating the process to file a lien against my property with the county recorder's office, a lien that would have been completely fraudulent since they had no legitimate debt from me and no authority over my property whatsoever. My attorney sent another, more strongly worded letter. This one threatened immediate legal action if the HOA attempted to file any lien or take any action against my property. It also demanded they cease all communication with me and remove my property from any HOA records. This time the letter came from the HOA's attorney, not Karen directly. It was full of legal doublespeak, but the gist was they believed they had authority and they weren't backing down. My attorney advised me that I could sue them right then for harassment and declaratory judgment, but it would cost money up front even though I'd likely win. He suggested waiting to see if they actually tried to file the lien, which would be a clear-cut illegal action that would strengthen any lawsuit. I didn't want to sue my neighbors over something this stupid, so I waited. Meanwhile, Karen started a campaign of petty harassment. She'd take photos of my property from the street and send me violation notices for things like my trash can visible from the street on non-collection days even though I'd brought it in the same day, a leaf pile that sat for 2 days before I bagged it, my car parked in my driveway at an angle she deemed unacceptable, and my failure to have seasonal decorations appropriate to community standards during various holidays. I kept every single notice. My attorney told me to document everything, but not to engage with Karen directly anymore. All communication should go through him. Then came the survey demand. In June 2022, I received a formal letter from Karen in her capacity as HOA president. It stated that since I claimed my property wasn't part of the HOA, I needed to prove it by providing a current professional survey showing the exact boundaries. She gave me 30 days to comply or face escalated enforcement action. My lawyer said I had no legal obligation to do this since I'd already provided all the documentation proving my property wasn't in the HOA. But I saw an opportunity. This was Karen's mistake, and I was going to let her make it. I told my attorney to respond that I would be happy to comply with her request for a professional survey. I hired one of the best surveying companies in the state, the same one the county uses for disputed boundary cases. These weren't guys with a tape measure. They came out with GPS equipment, drones, and access to all the historical records at the county. I made sure to mention in my response that I would naturally expect the HOA to reimburse me for this survey since they were the ones requesting it. Karen apparently didn't think through what a professional survey would show. She probably expected I'd refuse or provide some amateur attempt she could dispute. She seemed pleased that I was finally cooperating. The surveyors came out and spent 3 full days doing a thorough boundary survey. They used GPS equipment accurate to within inches, compared current measurements against all historical plats going back to the original subdivision in 1978, and produced a detailed report with maps, coordinates, and photos. The total cost was $4,800, which I paid gladly because I knew what was coming. When I received the results 2 weeks later, they were even better than I'd hoped. Not only did the survey confirm that my property was completely outside the HOA boundaries by a significant margin, about 50 feet at the nearest point, it revealed something else. The survey showed that Karen's fence, which she'd installed the previous fall, actually encroached onto my property by about 15 feet along one section of our shared property line. She'd essentially stolen a slice of my land, probably because she'd never bothered to get a survey before putting up her fence. I had my lawyer send the complete survey results to Karen and the HOA board, along with an invoice for the $4,800 since they'd requested the survey. The letter politely noted that the survey definitively proved my property was not within HOA boundaries and never had been. It also included a separate notice that her fence was on my property and would need to be moved within 30 days at her expense, or I would have it removed and bill her for the work. The response came fast. The HOA refused to pay for the survey, claiming they'd never actually agreed to pay for it, only requested it. Karen sent me a separate letter saying the survey must be wrong and that she'd had her fence professionally installed, so there was no way it was on my property. She wasn't moving anything. My attorney pointed out that she'd demanded the survey, I'd complied, and now she was refusing to accept the results because they didn't support her narrative. He advised me that I had every legal right to remove the fence section on my property, so I did exactly what I'd warned her I would do. I hired a fence removal company, showed them the survey results, and had them tear out the section of Karen's fence that was on my property. The section they removed was about 20 feet long. It left her backyard fence with a gaping hole on one side. I had the removed fence section stacked neatly on the property line and sent her a bill for $1,200 for the removal service. Karen absolutely lost her mind. She called the sheriff's department claiming I'd destroyed her property and demanding I be arrested for vandalism. The deputy who responded was professional and patient. He looked at the survey, looked at the fence line, and explained to Karen that the fence had been on my property according to the professional survey. By building on my land without permission, she'd essentially made it my fence to do with as I pleased. She could file a civil suit if she disagreed, but there was no criminal matter here. Karen's face went bright red. She started yelling at the deputy about how I was a troublemaker who refused to follow community rules. The deputy politely extracted himself from the situation and advised us both to handle any further disputes through our attorneys. That's when Karen's harassment went into absolute overdrive. I think the fence situation broke something in her brain and she became obsessed with punishing me. For the next 2 months, I received violation notices almost daily. She'd photograph my property from every possible angle looking for violations. My mailbox was crooked. There were dandelions in my lawn. My garden hose was visible from the street. My car needed washing. A package sat on my porch for 3 hours before I got home from work. On and on and on. I kept every single notice in a binder. My attorney said we were building an excellent harassment case. The notices alone proved a pattern of obsessive, targeted harassment based on a property dispute Karen had already lost, according to professional survey evidence. Then I got a great opportunity at work. My company was sending me to a specialized training facility in California for 2 weeks. It was all expenses paid, great for my career, and I'd be staying in corporate housing. I'd been looking forward to it for months. I left on a Tuesday morning in late August. I'd arranged for my neighbor on the other side, Mike, to keep an eye on my place. Mike was a good guy, retired teacher, thought the whole HOA situation was ridiculous. I gave him my number and told him to call if anything came up. Everything was fine for the first 8 days. The training was intense but valuable. I'd check in with Mike every couple of days and he'd report that everything looked good at my house. On day 9, while I was in a classroom session, my phone buzzed with a text from Mike. I couldn't look at it until lunch break. When I finally checked, my stomach dropped. The text said, "You need to call me right now. Karen did something crazy." I stepped outside and called him immediately. Mike sounded angry and apologetic at the same time. He told me that around 10 that morning, Karen had shown up at my house with two guys from a locksmith company. They'd drilled out my locks, both front and back door, and replaced them with new ones. Mike had watched the whole thing from his kitchen window. He'd gone out and asked what was going on, and Karen had told him that the HOA was taking emergency action to secure my property due to code violations and unpaid fines. I told her she couldn't do that, Mike said. I told her you'd have her arrested. She just smiled and said everything was legal and approved by the HOA board. I took photos and video of the whole thing. I didn't know if I should call the cops or what. I was in complete shock. She changed my locks? She can't do that. That's illegal. I know, Mike said. What do you want me to do? I told him I'd handle it and immediately called my attorney. When I explained what happened, there was a long pause on the line. Then he said, "She just committed several crimes. This is going to end very badly for her." He advised me to come home immediately if possible, document everything, and go to the sheriff's department with all my documentation. He'd draft the legal papers we needed. He also said he'd start preparing a lawsuit that would include everything from the harassment to the illegal lockout, and Karen was probably looking at criminal charges on top of the civil liability. I explained the situation to my supervisor at the training. He was sympathetic and said the company would cover my flight home and I could finish the training remotely. I booked the next flight out, which wasn't until the following morning. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about Karen in my house, changing my locks, violating my property. The sheer audacity of it, the complete disregard for the law and my rights. I'd been patient, I'd tried to be reasonable. I'd followed proper legal channels, and she'd responded by literally locking me out of my own home. The flight home felt like it took forever. I landed around 2 in the afternoon and drove straight home. Mike came out when he saw me pull up. He'd printed out the photos and had the video on his phone. The photos clearly showed Karen standing on my front porch watching the locksmith work. You could see her pointing and directing. It was all the evidence I needed. I couldn't get into my own house. I tried my keys and they obviously didn't work. The locks were completely different. I took photos of that too. Then I went to the sheriff's department. I brought everything. My deed, my title insurance policy, the survey showing my property boundaries, the closing documents showing no HOA, every violation notice Karen had sent me, the cease and desist letters from my attorney, Mike's photos of the lockout, and my keys that no longer worked. The deputy at the front desk listened to my initial explanation and called for a supervisor. The supervisor came out, looked at the stack of documents I'd brought, and called for another deputy who apparently handled property crimes. We ended up in a small conference room while I explained the entire situation from the beginning. The deputy handling my case reviewed everything carefully. He looked at the deed, the survey, the title documents, the photos. He made some calls to confirm details with the county recorder's office, then he looked at me and said this was clearly an illegal lockout and breaking and entering. However, he explained that typically I'd need to file a police report and get a court order for assistance with regaining entry. But given that I had overwhelming documentation proving ownership, the locks had just been changed the day before, and we had photos of Karen actually directing the locksmith, he agreed this was an active crime scene. He said he'd accompany me to my property to ensure I could regain access, and to prevent any confrontation since Karen had already shown she was willing to break the law. My attorney met us at my house. We drove there in a small convoy, my lawyer in his car, me in my truck, and the deputy in his patrol vehicle. Karen was home. I could see her car in her driveway and movement through her front window. I knocked on my own front door, which felt surreal. Karen answered. The look on her face when she saw me standing there with a deputy and a lawyer was almost worth everything I'd been through. "I need the keys to my house," I said calmly. "This property is under HOA enforcement action," she said, actually trying to keep up the pretense. "You can contact the HOA management company during business hours to discuss." My lawyer stepped forward and introduced himself. He handed the deputy copies of all my property documents while explaining to Karen that she had illegally changed locks on property she had no authority over, which constituted breaking and entering, illegal lockout, and potentially other charges. Karen's face went from confident to pale. The HOA board approved this. "We have the right to secure properties that—" "You have no rights to this property whatsoever," my attorney cut her off. "This property is not now, nor has it ever been, part of your HOA. You know this because you demanded he provide a survey proving it, and that survey definitively showed his property is completely outside HOA boundaries. You've been harassing my client for months despite multiple cease and desist orders. And now you've committed multiple crimes." The deputy asked Karen directly for the keys. She tried to argue. The deputy told her she could hand over the keys voluntarily, or he could charge her right then and obtain them as evidence. She went inside and came back with 2 new keys on a ring. I opened my front door with the new key and walked through my house. Nothing appeared disturbed or missing, thankfully. Karen had just changed the locks, not actually entered to any significant degree from what I could tell. The deputy took a full statement from me right there. He also went next door and got a statement from Mike, along with copies of the photos and the video. He told me he'd be forwarding everything to the district attorney's office for prosecution. He gave me a case number and his card. Before they left, my attorney handed Karen a notice of intent to file a civil lawsuit. She tried to say something, but he cut her off. Don't speak to my client. Don't approach his property. Don't send any more letters or notices. Any further contact will be considered harassment and will be added to the lawsuit and the criminal complaint. Have your attorney contact me if you have anything to say. We left her standing on her porch looking stunned. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal activity. The criminal charges came through about 6 weeks later. The prosecutor's office had apparently fast-tracked it given how clear-cut the evidence was and the fact that Karen had essentially confessed to the deputy at the scene. She was charged with breaking and entering, illegal lockout, and criminal trespass. All misdemeanors, but serious ones. My attorney filed the civil lawsuit shortly after that. We sued both Karen personally and the HOA. The complaint laid out everything. The months of harassment despite clear evidence my property wasn't in the HOA, the demand for a survey that proved them wrong, the illegal fence encroachment on my property, and the illegal lockout. We asked for compensatory damages for my legal fees, the emergency flight home, lost wages, emotional distress, and the cost of the survey Karen had demanded. We also asked for punitive damages. The HOA's insurance company got involved quickly. They were not happy when they saw all the documentation. Apparently, Karen had never informed them of the dispute or the survey results or the legal letters from my attorney. She'd been acting on her own while claiming HOA authority. The insurance company's lawyers started trying to separate the HOA from Karen's actions. The case took about 18 months to work through the legal system. During that time, we went through discovery, depositions, and mediation attempts. The depositions were interesting. Karen maintained she'd been acting in good faith to enforce community standards. My attorney systematically destroyed that argument by walking her through each step. The cease and desist letters she'd ignored, the survey she'd demanded that proved her wrong, the legal letters from the HOA's own attorney that should have warned her she was on shaky ground. By the end of her deposition, even her own lawyer looked frustrated with her. The HOA board voted to remove Karen as president about 6 months into the lawsuit. Several board members gave statements that she'd acted without proper board authorization for many of her actions toward me. They'd apparently voted to enforce community standards in general terms, but never specifically voted to change my locks or take action against property outside their jurisdiction. Karen had been interpreting vague board guidance as carte blanche to do whatever she wanted. The criminal case resolved first. Karen took a plea deal to avoid trial. She pled guilty to misdemeanor breaking and entering and illegal lockout. She got a suspended sentence with probation, community service, and was ordered to stay away from my property. She also had to pay restitution for the locksmith I'd had to hire to change my locks back to ones I wanted. The civil case settled before going to trial. The HOA's insurance company finally agreed to settle when they realized how bad this would look to a jury. A woman obsessively harassing her neighbor and illegally changing his locks while he was out of town, all while claiming HOA authority she didn't have. The optics were terrible. The total settlement came to just over $85,000. That was enough to cover all my legal fees, which had been substantial, compensation for the harassment campaign, the illegal lockout, my lost wages and expenses from having to fly home early, the cost of the survey Karen had demanded, and punitive damages to send a message. The HOA's insurance paid most of it, but Karen was personally liable for a portion since she'd acted outside her authority. Karen put her house up for sale about 3 months after the settlement. She moved before it even sold. I heard through Mike that she took a job in another state and basically fled. Her house eventually sold at a loss because she was desperate to get out. The HOA never bothered me again. The new board president actually apologized to me in writing and confirmed in official HOA records that my property was not within their jurisdiction. Several of my neighbors who'd witnessed the whole thing resigned from the HOA in protest of how the board had handled everything. I'm still in my house. I still love it. My garden is bigger now. My grass is exactly as long as I want it to be. I have no plans to move. The irony isn't lost on me. Karen demanded I prove my property boundaries with a professional survey, thinking it would somehow support her claims of HOA authority. Instead, that survey proved she was the one violating property lines by encroaching on my land with her fence. Her own demanded evidence destroyed her credibility and triggered the chain of events that eventually cost her everything. When I pull into my driveway now and see my house exactly as I want it, I remember the look on Karen's face when the deputy handed me those keys, the keys to my own house that she'd had no right to change. She'd been so convinced she had authority over me that she'd committed multiple crimes to enforce rules that never applied to my property in the first place. She wanted me to follow her rules. I followed the actual law instead. She demanded proof my property wasn't in her HOA. I got professional proof that not only was my property outside her jurisdiction, but her own property was encroaching on mine. She tried to lock me out of my own house. I came back with the sheriff and my deed and watched her world crumble. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting someone dig their own hole deeper and deeper until they can't climb out. Karen had so many opportunities to back down, to check with a real attorney, to accept the survey results she'd demanded. Instead, she doubled down every time until she committed actual crimes. I complied with her demand for a survey. I complied with every legal requirement to prove my ownership and protect my rights. And that compliance, that adherence to proper documentation and legal process, gave her exactly enough rope to hang herself. The next one is a pro-revenge story. Way back in the early 2000s, I began to suspect that my wife was up to something. Our two kids were about 4 and 6, still young, but not so young they couldn't tell you something about what had happened in their day. They started talking a lot about staying with my wife's parents during the day, which wasn't really that strange in and of itself, but since they lived about 90 minutes away, doing so 2 or 3 times a week seemed a bit much. That was basically every day she wasn't working at her part-time job. When I asked her about it, she denied it, but was never a good liar. So I started tracking the mileage on her car, and sure enough, she was driving an extra 400 or so miles per week. I knew some crap was going on. Then one day I sat down at the computer and she had left a sticky note with her AOL password written on it next to the keyboard. I could not resist and logged in to read her emails and saw a few email exchanges between her and her college BFF where they discussed how my wife was regularly ducking one of her ex-BFs from high school. No mention of details about him other than my wife also talking crap about his wife making fun of how she'd gotten fat after having kids. Anyway, I printed out these email exchanges and stashed them. I still needed to know the details, so I called a friend who was a cop and he suggested I call a guy he knew that had left the force to become a PI. Ron was great. I paid his retainer and gave him the emails and what little I knew about my wife's activities, and he figured out exactly what she was doing. His report detailed with photos and times, dates, locations, all about how she would take the kids to her parents, then go meet this guy for lunch, then they'd go to a dumpy motel for a few hours, after which she'd pick up the kids and return home. At this point, I hired a divorce lawyer. My parents cheated on each other and the fallout absolutely ducked mine and my siblings' childhood. It was something that was totally unacceptable. I also asked Ron to find out what he could about this guy. Ron absolutely came through. I learned his name, Bob, that he was married and had 3 kids. I also found out that he worked as a VP of sales for his father-in-law's business. At this point, I had my lawyer draw up the divorce papers. I also asked Ron for a couple more copies of his report, and one more thing I wanted him to do for me. On the same day I had my wife served with the divorce papers at her work, I had Ron meet with this guy's wife and show her everything he'd found out. She seemed nice, and I figured that she deserved to know what her dear hubby was up to. What she did with that information was up to her. While the information about my wife's infidelity didn't really matter in my divorce proceedings, Bob's wife did a real number on him. According to the publicly available court documents from the divorce and other related proceedings, she cleaned out their joint account, took the kids, and left. As soon as her dad found out what he'd done, Bob was fired, and since her parents actually owned the house where Bob and his wife lived, he also got evicted. Their divorce was ugly. Lots of fighting in, and evidently out of court. I guess Bob went to the house and started arguing with his wife, and it escalated to the point that her brother stepped in and Bob got his nose broken. There were restraining orders, a few more incidents with police reports, criminal charges, jail time, and so on. I can't find Bob on the internet anywhere these days. Last I heard, he'd left the state and his ex-wife did okay. She went to work at her dad's company and took over after he retired. As for me, my ex and I got along well enough. I didn't engage with her on anything that wasn't related to the kids, and now that they're both adults, I don't talk to her at all anymore. I don't hate her or anything, but I only care in the context that she is my kid's mom and is important to them, nothing beyond that. The next one is a malicious compliance story. In light of all the generic AI slop this subreddit has been flooded with, I figured I would finally share the malicious compliance story I have been holding on to for a while. It has been many years since I worked for the company involved, but if you know anything about the industry, then you know its name was basically an acronym for My Ride. It was a private ambulance company that held the local contract to transport patients to the hospital when they called COP. Under the contract, the city or county paid the company a flat rate to ensure that an ambulance responded and arrived on scene within 8 minutes and 59 seconds of being dispatched. On top of that, the company was allowed to bill the patient's insurance for transportation and the cost of treatment. Given the size and layout of our service area, that response requirement was fairly reasonable. The contract allowed up to 10% of our calls to be classified as a late response, meaning the ambulance arrived 9 minutes or more after dispatch. The ratio of on-time calls to late calls was what we called compliance. At 98% compliance, everything was golden. At 89% compliance, emails started flying and phones started ringing. The important part was that we had to maintain compliance on a daily basis. We could have 0% compliance from midnight until 3 in the morning, but as long as the numbers recovered and reached 90% or higher by the end of the day, the company was still considered compliant. Here was the real kicker. Management was the only entity responsible for reporting those numbers to the county. That meant the figures were scrubbed, manipulated, and fudged in every possible direction. Management could apply special delays or exemptions that removed certain response times from the reports by classifying them as outliers. Those exemptions were supposed to be used when an ambulance was delayed by something outside its control, such as a train crossing, road construction, or severe weather. Management abused those exemptions constantly to make sure the reported numbers remained compliant. Considering that we were responsible for the care and safety of critically ill or injured patients, you might assume the company would staff enough ambulances to handle the population in our service area, with a few extra crews available in case something major happened. You would be wrong, they were trying to make money. If management believed it could maintain compliance with fewer employees, it did. Even when we could not maintain compliance, the company simply used the delay exemptions to make the reports look better. It was not as though anyone was auditing them anyway. We were chronically understaffed. We constantly operated at what was called level 0, meaning there were 0 ambulances available to respond to incoming calls. If corporate management had its way, we would have remained at level 0 constantly while somehow maintaining compliance. To them, that would have represented peak efficiency, and the shareholders would have been delighted. We were pressured to drive unsafely through stop signs and red lights and to travel faster than conditions reasonably allowed. One of our supervisors even taught us how to use the cruise control to bypass the speed limiter installed in the ambulances. We were exhausted and overworked. We spent more time driving in high-stress conditions than transportation regulations would ever allow commercial truck drivers to approach. We complained to the union. We tried reporting the situation to the county. Nothing changed. Eventually, we had enough. The company's contract renewal was approaching. Management needed our response times to look perfect so it could secure another 4 years of service. That was when the crews collectively decided that enough was enough. We began following every law and safety requirement governing emergency driving. When responding with lights and sirens, we stopped at every stop sign and every red light. We refused to drive faster than we considered safe for the road, traffic, and weather conditions. We absolutely destroyed the company's response time numbers. Unless the call involved a genuinely critical emergency, we took a reasonable and legally defensible amount of time reaching every stomachache and stub toe, which made up approximately 90% of our calls. The delay exemptions could not hide the scale of the collapse. Within 2 weeks, management had called numerous meetings with the crews. The problem was that they could not discipline us for driving safely and obeying the law. Eventually, management began staffing additional ambulances in an attempt to restore compliance before the end of the month. The increased staffing lasted for a while. I eventually found another job and left the company behind. I have never looked back. I miss the work. I do not miss the company. Anyway, thank you for watching.